You have reached our final episode on this season of Making Space. And for Jay and I, this is more than a wrap-up. We feel like this is the crescendo. And on this conversation, we go on a journey that's personal to both of us as local church pastors to really find the practical expression of so much of what we've talked about. And so, Jay Kim, welcome. I'm so looking forward to just talking you and I today.
I know. It's, on top of all the incredible conversations, the amazing things just I personally, as a Christian and as a follower of Jesus and as a church leader, have learned over our 2 seasons together, maybe the biggest win is that you and I have become friends. And you're my favorite Australian of all time, Benjamin. I just need you to know that.
Well, I'm very moved by that. And I feel like, flying up there to Northern California and looking forward to sharing a meal with you soon. Jay, I've pastored for 2 decades.
Yeah.
Church planted for 14 of those years. And I'm a pastor's kid. And I still remember the old church buildings that my dad would preach in, like laying on the carpet on the front row, playing with Lego. And I can say this about my own journey, that those physical environments served as sanctuaries to what God was building in my heart. I really do believe that space and place matter. As a church planter, I can look back over those 14 years and almost chart the journey of that congregation with the buildings, which is kind of a weird thought, because obviously church is not a building, but I think buildings and spaces are so significant that they do become markers on the journey. I remember starting in a cinema theater and what that represented. Yeah. I remember when one of our facilities flooded and another one burnt down in the same year, and what that did to the fabric of our community. So one of the things I know we've learned on this conversation, and we're learning the significance of space for those of us that pastor and lead communities in a very practical sense. Space really does matter.
Yeah. It's interesting how the connection, the sort of nostalgic sort of memory attachment to these experiences that happen in places. I have very similar experiences. I grew up in a Korean American church, in an immigrant church. And for a lot of immigrant churches, very different than sort of the modern Western majority culture church, immigrant churches are not, immigrants typically don't think about church as an hour and 15 minutes on a Sunday. They think of it as the hub, the epicenter of their sort of social life, understandably so. You're in a new place and you find a church, and that becomes sort of, there are others like me and I can go there to be with them and find support, outside of the sort of communal seeking of God and formation into Christ likeness. So I have really similar memories of, growing up and being at church 3-4 days a week. And on Sundays being at my little Korean American church, not for an hour and 15 minutes, but for like 6-7 hours, go to youth group in the morning. And then there was lunch, and then we would hang out in the youth room and just watch movies or goof off, whatever it might be, play music, all sorts of things. And one of the first things, and I think we'll get into some of the more practical, functional stuff in this conversation as we wrap up the season. But what it makes me think of is, in our conversation with Al Gordon at Saint Church, early on, I remember in the interview, I asked him a question, and it was a pretty functional question. And then he spent 10 minutes not answering the question, but talking about how all of this has to find itself first and foremost. His words were, you can't start at the drawing board or the Pinterest board. You got to start at the floorboard. And what he meant was you got to start in prayer, seeking God. And what it makes me think is, the buildings I inhabited in churches growing up, They were not flashy. They weren't even beautifully, like artistically crafted. A lot of them were just kind of like old carpet and broken down. And I think the church leaders could have done a better job. But why was it transformative? It's because I think the space is first and foremost crafted by the warmth and welcome and the sort of invitational spirit that exists there, which can overcome some actual physical spatial issues we have. And again, we'll get into the conversation about the physical spaces, but I think there's a way for those of us who are listening who maybe, and I know a lot of our listeners are serving and leading churches that are smaller. Maybe our budget isn't that big. Maybe we love these stories of, Saint Church or Dave Lomas at Reality and all these big dreams, which is really beautiful. But we're like, man, I don't have the money and I'll never really probably have the money to be able to do something like that. And I would just encourage those of us who are in those situations, you cannot underestimate the spatial power of an invitational culture of warmth. That can overcome so many of the physical challenges we have in the spaces that we inhabit.
Well, to your point, Jay, I think a lot of church planters will attest to this in their journey, that something often changes in the trajectory of a church plant when a church plant moves from having temporary facilities to permanent facilities. In that, they'll often say, we lost something. I remember in my journey, those early days, you're rolling out carpet, you're setting up lights, you're stacking chairs, and it's a slog. There's nothing about that that's glamorous or fun, trust me.
Yeah.
But it is interesting then when, I remember getting the beautiful multi-million-dollar facility, raising the funds, going on the whole journey with the church, and how weird to then look back on those earlier days going, there was something about the physicality of rolling out the carpet, setting out a chair, of preparing a space for people, the interactive element of preparing a space.
Yeah. Benjamin, talk more about that, because you've teased out some of your story in the midst of some of our conversations. You even teased some of it out here already, but your story is really fascinating. I mean, you really did truly lead church congregations through some significant physical space journeys. So I don't know, as you've listened to so many of the wonderful conversations we've had this season and thought back on your journey of leading church congregations through sort of transitions in physical space, what are some things that stand out to you that might be encouraging even on a practical level? Yeah, again, for the majority of our listeners who, like me, like you, when you were leading a church, have limitations on what we can do. Our dreams are really big, but there are real limitations. So how do we find some freedom, even in spite of some of those limitations?
I think there's a parallel journey that congregations go on in terms of their spiritual journey and their facility journey. So again, that's my perspective. I think they're very significantly linked. And for me, yes, we raised money, we remodeled an old warehouse. I mean, we did a whole range of things, finally got into a beautiful facility that took years. I think looking back, one of the things that I was idealistic about was when we had to move from kind of what had been a long-term facility, but we were getting built out and had no parking left. And I communicated to our church, so this is on me, Jay. Church is not a building. So i.e., we have to move, but don't get too emotional about this. This is just a building. We got a new building. I think looking back, I was idealistic because one of the things I've learned in these conversations with yourself and with our guests is, hang on a second, we embody a space. And these spaces come to mean something very significant to those communities. And I would put it, I think I'd summarize some of my learnings in a question, Jay, and it would be this. And I had this conversation just last week with a pastor. If we walked into our own church and asked this one question, what does our architecture say about who we are as an organization? Not just the physical architecture, but the overall design. I think if we're honest with ourselves, most modern day churches, like if you looked in and you're an alien beamed down to earth and you walk into a modern day church and we ask this question, hey, you've never been into this place, this space before. What does this kind of place do? Wouldn't we honestly say it's a concert venue, it's a theater, it's an event? I don't think we would say, oh, this is a home, this is a family, this is warmth. And that's not a critique as much as what it is, I think, owning the reality of that as a starting point. Because often we say we're not event-driven, we're not meeting-driven, we're missional, but our buildings are arguing with us. They're arguing with our narrative. Because our buildings communicate to people before we ever say something from the platform. I think that you can see a lot of our theology by just walking into our physical spaces. Things like the distance between, laity and priest, power differential. And asking this question, what communicates more, our space or our slogan? Because a lot of our slogans say welcome home, place to call home, it's family. But our environments, if we can look through a fresh perspective, maybe don't preach the same message as what our physical design does. And I think it's worthy of recognizing it, having conversations about it, and where we can, finding low-hanging fruit to go about some of those adjustments.
Yeah, I love that question. What communicates more, our space or our slogan? And I totally agree, Benjamin. I love what you said there, that it's not just a blanket critique. This is not an invitation. So everybody listening, get rid of your stage. Don't have a microphone. Sit in the round where, no one can see you. And it's not that. It's more, maybe, if I was hearing you right, and I think this really resonates with me, it's more acknowledging, understanding, and leading and serving with a very clear, sober awareness that our space is designed a particular way for functional reasons, but that design also often creates for us a communal deficit, that it communicates, whether we want it to or not, that you are walking in here as an audience to listen to watch, the professionals, or to consume Christian content. And then to not scrap the whole model, because then functionally you'd have all sorts of other problems. But the sober awareness of that deficit allows us then to try and make up the deficit in a variety of ways. In the way we welcome,
with you, Jay.
And the way we welcome, and the way we communicate up front. It's really interesting, Benjamin. This is such a small thing, and it's going to sound like I'm patting myself on the back. I'm really not. This is a team thing. It's a culture that I inherited from my predecessor here at our church. But I have heard in the last 2 years, from people who are new to our church, who come to our sort of welcome meeting, our welcome lunch that we do once a month, people who are new to our church. No joke. Every single month, there are multiple people who come up to me and will say something along the lines of, hey, what's been really refreshing for me coming here to this church is that whenever anybody gets up on the stage, nobody says, hey, I'm so-and-so, and then includes a title. Everybody here says, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm a part of the team here, and we are so glad you're with us. Multiple people have said that to me. Now, we do it because it's just our culture. We don't have a culture that, and I'm not critiquing churches that do emphasize titles. We just don't. But what I found is we have unintentionally stumbled into one small way to try to make up for that communal deficit. That people are already assuming I'm here as an audience, that person with a microphone up there, that's the pastor or that's the whatever. And instead, they're a little bit, in a beautiful way, jarred by the fact that nobody really, like we are pastors, but nobody tries to take on that moniker. Everyone tries to speak in a language that feels like, hey, I'm a part of a team, and we're really glad that you're here. Whenever you're ready, we'd love to help you take further steps into the life of our community. So the more and more in our spaces we can acknowledge that the functionality of our space communicates something and then respond to that appropriately. Yeah, I love that. Again, coming back to the question, our slogan or our space, which one communicates more is brilliant.
You've put that so well. And that's a reality, right, Jay? Like once you get over 30, 40, 50 people, you probably need a stage. Once you start getting into the hundreds of churchgoers, there becomes just a reality about aisles and people movement and foyers and so forth. But recognizing that, I think recognition is so important. The awareness around, okay, but within all of this practicalities, how are we, or what is the emotion of this space portraying? And that's why for me, I've become obsessed with foyer spaces because there's only so much you can do with an auditorium or a sanctuary, especially when you're considering local church budgets. Like, if you don't have $10 million to go and buy an old cathedral and you're just looking at, hey, we've actually got, $250,000 of just maintenance that we need to do on this facility annually, right? All of those realities that pastors wrestle with. But if it's like, hey, even if we didn't touch the auditorium and we did things exactly like what you just said, Jay, you're using language and very intentional communication from the stage to make up for what you described as the communal deficit. What can we do in foyers to make it feel like a hug so that it doesn't feel like a large cavernous space? So for example, Jay, if I flew up to meet with you in Northern California and I'm like, Jay, where are we going to meet? Where are we going to hang out? And you just, you Google map me an address and I turn up. And it's like, wow, Jay, you just selected an empty warehouse with a 100-foot high ceiling and it's you and I, and we're just going to stand there on a concrete floor. Who'd be like, this is weird, Jay. This is an unusual environment for us to get to know each other. I would expect more of a quaint, cool Silicon Valley coffee place where what is happening? I'll tell you what's happening. We're sitting at a table. We're sitting behind chairs. We're drinking coffee. The warmth and intimacy of that space. And so where pastors and leaders can go to work, warming up our foyers and our lobbies.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know you've done a lot of work and a lot of thinking behind foyers. Yeah, and I love some of that work. I've seen actually, you've shown me images of your sort of church story and some beautiful things you did to create more communal space. I think that's a great word for everybody listening, leading churches large and small, even the church planters who are renting a high school cafeteria, which is something I did for several years. When I was a part of a church plant, we rented a high school cafeteria. Now we are out here in California where we have sunshine 9 months out of the year. So what we were able to do was this large quad, this open air quad at this high school became our foyer. And we try to be really intentional about the flow and how we design that space, not using a lot of money, just all temporary stuff that kind of stayed in box trucks that we had to pull out every day. But we tried to design it in such a way where there was a real clear communication to folks. We want you to linger. This is not a hierarchical space. Some people don't sit up here and others sit here. It was very sort of even and lots of space to sit, lots of space to roam around, to walk from spot to spot, lots of benches, which were sort of an invitation. Hey, grab a coffee, grab a pastry and sit and have a conversation. I think all of us can do that, and I think it was in our conversation with Dave Lomas, and he was telling us a story about somebody he was interacting with when he was out in Europe, and they were in some cathedral, and this person told him the goal of entering this cathedral space is to have your feet firmly planted on the ground and your gaze lifted upward. And I thought that that was so beautiful and so profound. And I have felt that exact sort of transcendent immanence of God in cathedrals myself and in church buildings here in the States as well. But I thought the one sort of maybe not missing component, because I know Dave and he's very much about community. The one piece that we could add to that is not simply to have our gaze fixed upward, but to have our gaze fixed upward together and to then have our collective gaze face outward toward one another. And I think if we can have whatever the paradigm is for you as a church leader listening, if we can create that sort of paradigm and say, okay, everything we do spatially, without a lot of money, with whatever God's given us, we want to look at it through this paradigm. I love that line because that can be a paradigm. I want the foyer to feel like a big hug, And I've heard Kara Powell, who's done a lot of work with Barna. She says, warm is the new cool. And some of the Barna research is showing that, right? That most people today who in the Aspen Barna studies, they don't really want trendy. They want traditional. They don't really want, energetic. They want solemn. They say things like, yeah, I think a church should be for the community. I think it should reflect community. I think it should be a place where we can bring our grief and sorrows as well as our joys and successes and share them with one another. So I think if we can create those paradigms, even with whatever limitations we're all facing, there are creative ways that we can create those sorts of spaces.
So if that's the case, Jay, that people are saying traditional, solemn, reflective, if I were to interpret some of what we've heard from our wonderful guests and the data that we've looked at during this season through the practitioner journey that I've gone on for the last 20 years, and I'm speaking to a pastor that's maybe about to do a new facility or set a vision over the next 5 years to remodel a facility. Send your complaint emails to Jay Kim if this doesn't sit well with you. But this is my instinctive read, is that we are seeing a movement, I wouldn't say away from, but there's some kind of shift happening when we consider LED screens, right? I don't want to pick on LED screen. I mean, have an LED screen, right? But the ultra modern stage-driven production where everything is so slick and the best of everything, and I don't think we need to do away with that and incorporate or remove excellence from our stage expressions. It's hard to describe, but I think within all of that, there's a movement towards simplicity. I'll say it another way, Jay. Think about the sustainable home movement.
Yeah.
Right. Which kind of describes, okay, it's not about mega square footage or opulence, or it's about connection to the local environment or locally sourced materials. Really, when you get into the idea behind sustainable living and sustainable homes, it's not really just about energy efficiency. It's that the spaces communicate a way of life and a set of values. And that's really what I'm saying, that our environments would communicate more accurately the things that we truly value as faith communities and churches. So if we value human connection in the midst of a loneliness epidemic, what should that be? How should we interpret that within our physical spaces? Or in other words, what would sustainable homes of faith look like for us?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I think my first sort of thought on it is exegeting your community, your city, your congregation, is so important because it's my personal opinion. I think it's a little bit dangerous to map onto a unique community in a particular context, some sort of particular aesthetic or sort of design philosophy. It's easy for me. I mean, I fall into this trap all the time. I I look at St. Church, in London, or I think about, what Dave Lomas is doing up at Reality and other places as well. I look at the photos of the things you've done in Australia. And there's a part of me sometimes that's like, oh, I just have to do that, but maybe the most important work we can do as church leaders, the most faithful work we can do, is to have those paradigms, right? How do I create warmth? How do I create a space that communicates we want this to feel like a big hug? Like it's not just a slogan. We want you to feel at home here. How do we embody simplicity? Not in a pretentious way. Because honestly, minimalism and simplicity, those things can just become pretentious idols as well. I've seen that where it's like, oh, there's a beautiful aesthetic here in this building. I mean, there's some coffee shops in this area. I won't name them and put them on blast, but there are some coffee shops in the area where the aesthetic is so beautiful and it's simple and gorgeous and sort of warm in some ways. But then there's a pretense in the coffee shop itself and the energy and the vibe and the baristas. And it's like, oh, we don't do that here. Or, oh, they make you feel kind of like dumb for not knowing how to order the super fancy drink or whatever. And so I think there's a way in which we have to ask the question, what does that look like for
a deconstructed latte, Jay? A deconstructed latte?
Exactly. So I do know what that is, I think. But, I don't know. I just think there's a lot there. I mean, I think a lot about, the fruit of the Spirit, right? And how the fruit of the Spirit is the thing that should mark us as a people. So not just as a people, but then does our space also accentuate and embody in some way love and joy and peace and patience? Right. Are we rushing people through this sort of conveyor belt of spirituality, or are we patient, and faithful and gentle and all those things? So, yeah, I mean, I think that all of us as church leaders have to do that work, and men and women like you who've done it for a long time, I think sort of have carved the path out for us.
Well, here is a perfect exercise for churches with their staff, Christian schools, businesses. Take your staff outside your building.
Yes.
And here's the exercise. You've never read a word on our website. You're an alien that's just been dropped here. You have no other context for what we are. You know nothing about what we do, who our pastors are, what our values are. And all you have to interpret who we are is our physical space. And walk through that space and ask questions like this. What effect does it have on me psychologically, emotionally? Does it spark innovation, imagination? Does it stifle it? Do I feel socially anxious walking into certain parts of it? Does it lift my gaze up? Is it confusing? Because again, our buildings are preaching a message before anybody ever hears us from the stage. And I think that would be a super interesting exercise for staff to then debrief and teams to say, okay, what is the sermon that we just heard without even using any words, because we are preaching that to attendees every single week. They walk onto our campus, park in our parking lots, walk into our foyers, check their kids into children's ministries. What did that communicate? And then does that marry up with our true values, or as you were just describing, Jay, those key phrases or questions? Does it marry up with that? And if not, then what are, the easiest, simplest next steps that we can take to form congruence between the values that are on our websites and on our walls, in terms of, they're typed out on our walls and put up on signs, and our physical spaces? And particularly, I want to pick on phrasing like welcome home. I've used these phrases myself, Jay, so I'm picking on myself. A church to call home, family, and just have those honest conversations. Does this feel like home if you're walking in for the first time? Does this feel like family? And if not, what can we do to make it feel more like that?
Yeah. I love that. That's a great word, Benjamin. I think that's a great word for our listeners to carry. Let it sort of ping around in their hearts and minds and carry on into their ministry. Yeah, before we wrap up here, for Benjamin and I both and the entire team here at Aspen and Barna, we just want to say thank you guys so much for being on this journey, for listening. Our hope and prayer is that it's been helpful. There's a lot more coming, so just be on the lookout. The team at Aspen and Barna are working hard. There's so much more really, really helpful data, information, and conversations that are coming your way. So be on the lookout for all of that. And once again, we're just so grateful that you've been listening in. Thank you so much for all of the love and support. And it's been a joy for Benjamin and I both to be on this journey with you all. And we will hopefully talk to you all very, very soon.
Yeah, come and join us in California for a deconstructed latte. How does that sound, Jay?
That's right. That's right.